All right. Um, only major new announcement that I'll add here is that there were comments in the Muddiest Points a little while back about people wanting to know more about automated software repair. And so I'll send, once this is etched in stone, which it almost is, I'll send a post to the Canvas site. But so I've asked Stephanie Forrest if she'd be willing to give a guest lecture, and so she was willing a week from today. And so a week from today, she will give a guest lecture on how they use genetic programming to do automated software repair. And I don't think that lecture will be recorded, and so hoping that we'll get, and that's why I'll send an announcement, a little more attendance for that, since Stephanie's going to be coming, Dr. Forrest is going to be coming to give that, and so I think it'll be a good experience, and so hopefully have a nice, warm, in-person reception for her for that. So I'll just add a note for that is that next week, um, on Thursday, which I believe is what, the 6th? I think that's the 6th. That will be Stephanie Forrest. So Dr. Stephanie Forrest. We're talking about automated software repair and Gen Prog, and probably no video. So I think that will be pretty cool. Um, and so I hope you'll look forward to that. Otherwise, standard announcements. Muddy's Point due Sunday. Concept check on the second half of Unit 3 due Sunday. Mini Project 3 due Sunday. And then Mini Project 4 not due until after spring break. Um, so that will be, so spring break, I think, is from like the 8th, that whole week there. So this is, I think, the the Sunday coming out of spring break, if I remember correctly, my calendar. All right, so last time we finished talking about Pareto ranking. We talked about how Pareto ranking, there's different ways to do it. And because we're so concerned about diversity and creating a spread across the Pareto frontier to grab every single trade-off. So we want to capture all of those niches of this community of solutions that we're sort of trying to present in this really difficult problem of multi-objective optimization. So we really are sensitive to things like selective pressure. So if we have too much selective pressure, then solutions that seem to be much higher in their Pareto ranking are going to dominate. And you're going to have, even though you get closer to the Pareto frontier, you end up collapsing to a point or a couple of points along the Pareto frontier, and that's not what we want. So, choosing the right ranking that is not doesn't have excessive selective pressure is important. Also, being able to modulate it with fitness scaling. And then also to do this, so fitness scaling we introduced back when we talked about the GA ways that if you got different selection operators, some have more ability to modulate pressure than others. So fitness scaling gives you a way to add on to that, gives you a little bit extra help. And then we talked about fitness sharing, which we're going to elaborate on in a new application here, and where in that case, if you have a bunch of individuals clustered in one area, then that niche sort of gets one amount of fitness and it's divided among everyone nearby. So that makes it unlikely for them all to survive, but there's still a good chance that one of them will survive and that will clear. So that's another term that we talk about here. The other one's out so that they can get spread around and hopefully spread out more and fill out more of that Pareto frontier. So that was sort of that kind of ended the previous unit, and then we kind of started this new unit here, unit 4 on meta populations, and what ultimately will lead to multimodal optimization. So where we left off last time in this meta populations area here is we talked about how theoretically, and the motivation here was initially use parallel computational resources to speed up GAs. So that was the idea that GAs, because they require a major population or whatever. I mean, you've got a bunch, so you have a large number of independent evaluations of a optimization objective. So the thought was, why not just distribute among parallel processors? And so there's a bunch of different ways you could do that. If you had a population size of 100 and you also had 100 threads, 100 cores that you could play with, then you could just evaluate everybody in parallel. And so in one iteration, then you could have your whole generation's fitnesses. So you have 100 fitnesses, then go to the next calculation, figure out, do centrally figure out who's going to survive and reproduce, and then redistribute to your 100 processors again. And then that's going to greatly speed up your GA. Now, you may not have one core available or one thread available for every one of your individuals to run in parallel. So another thought was, well, what if you just create subpopulations across computational resources? And so now we're into this sort of area of, parallel and distributed GAs. And there are still different ways you could do that. It could be that you just have one GA that you've just decided that 30 of my 100 population, I'll just do 33 here, 33 on this core, 33 on this core, 34 on this core. And I'm just going to go through and calculate my 33 fitnesses, my 33 fitnesses, my 34 fitnesses, and then I'm going to bring everything all together. So at least I speed things up. It's not as much as in one shot I can evaluate my whole population, but still I can do a third of the population in parallel. And that's going to speed things up quite a bit. So that's one simple way to do that. As people started experimenting with this, then they noticed that different ways in which you set up the dynamics among these processors not only changed the computational burden of the GA, or at least manage the computational burden of GAs in a different way, it also started to change the quality of the solutions coming out of the GA. So initially you might think that, well, if I just distribute my population up, but there's still effectively one population, they're just being evaluated in parallel. There's still a lot of computation that maybe has to go on in between that. I still need to coordinate that once these 33 finish, they have to wait for these 33 to finish, and they have to wait for these 34 to finish for the whole generation to finish. And then somebody is the central resource that collects all those fitnesses and then figures out the next generation and so on and so forth. So you could imagine, well, what if we just run 3 different GAs in parallel and then allow them to kind of run on their own clock, but then every once in a while allow for migration between them. So, that is, so I'll just, summarizing here, many, different ways to parallelize the GA. But consider running independent, small GAs on processors with periodic migration. So you run the GA here, you run a GA there, you run a GA there, and these populations are hopefully all being selected for the same optimization objective. So this is all, so this, keep in mind, this is single objective. And so you're going to get solutions hopefully you might think hopefully roughly the same solution on these three, but there's still going to be variance. And so the thought was, well, they'll, they can kind of run at their own clip, and then with migration, then innovations here can still help benefit innovations here can start help benefiting innovations here, but it's probably not going to be that much different. And in fact, maybe there's more liability because these smaller populations will get kind of the cons of running a small population size in a GA. So hopefully, as some of you experience in your mini project, if you run small population sizes, then you leave a lot more up to chance because you're kind of just sort of counting on you've got this random sample of this kind of distribution that's evolving over time. And sometimes you actually don't get high fitness out of it, and those can be maintained in the population. That's what we mean by drift. And so drift becomes kind of more important. But the surprising thing is that when you distribute a GA this way, sometimes it seems to be much better at finding global optima faster. So one of the results from this is that happens to be I'll say often faster at finding global optima. So this approach often seems to get out of local traps. So if you have a fitness function with a bunch of different peaks, then if one of them's lower than another one, but you just happen to find that one first, especially if you have high selective pressure, you tend to be held onto that lower peak. Because if you get a small deviations off that lower peak, then your high selective pressure will then still the ones above that peak are going to be much better than the small deviations out of it. So you have this problem that you don't ever want to make small deviations over the short time scale, but you need to make some small deviations that possibly are going to degrade in fitness in order to explore the space that's got this much better peak way over here for maximizing. So, and these seem to be better at doing that. So if you have this, multi-modal fitness landscape, so this is our optimization objective. And we'll just say here that we're maximizing. So this is our F, which we're maximizing. And this is our landscape might look like this. So ideally, we would like to find, this is our true global optimum here. But there are all of these distractors, so these are kind of local distractors. And so if you had a population that is over here, and so, if you've got a couple of individuals on this peak here, then this individual, if you have high selective pressure, will attract population to this point. And so that makes it very hard to find other peaks. And so we call these things down here adaptive valleys. And you may need to cross in the short term to find other peaks in the long term. But natural selection is sort of a greedy optimizer, so it can get stuck in these things here. But when people started to implement these distributed GAs, where the GAs were kind of running independently, but then periodically migrating, then they found that these adaptive valleys were being crossed more easily, more quickly. And so that seemed, a little strange, but it turns out that there was a theory from a population geneticist a couple decades before that actually predicted this. That particular theory has changed the conversation in biology. Whether biology has shown that nature uses the mechanism that I'm just going to about to describe um, exactly as it was described is not clear. It's definitely made people think more about these effects, but at least the way it was originally described actually better fits what is thought to happen in terms of distributed and parallel GAs that do this. And so that's why I'm about to bring it up. So this is the general problem. Interesting observation. Distributed architectures tend to do a better job at eventually getting here. So distributed GAs with meta populations, so populations of populations, so pop of pop, get here faster for the same number of individuals. All right, so any questions about the general layout of this problem before I talk about the theory of why this seems to be the case? Okay. All right, so what I'm going to outline is something from, again, population geneticist Sewall Wright, their so-called shifting balance theory. So Sewall Wright shifting balance theory. And let me just make sure that I'm not missing anything that I wanted to tell you before here. All right, that seems fine. Okay. So and then I guess I might, maybe one thing that I'll add here is that back on this picture, I do want to say that the kind of the height of this here. So how spread out the population is sort of here, I guess. Um, this sort of height and technically this spread. Does anybody have a guess as to, what sort of hyperparameter is, determines kind of how tight these things? It's like for if I don't change very much, but if I just change one hyperparameter, what kind of like if I'm stuck on this local hill, what do you think affects the spread of these points along that hill? Like if I could imagine I've got a whole bunch of points clustered right here, or I run this thing generation to generation to generation, and the points move around, but they always kind of stay spread out like down the hill this far. Yeah. Well, so yeah, let's not worry about the diversification. I'm just saying that what do you think determines how spread out they are here? Like if I have, a population where a bunch are way up here versus a population that are spread out here, what do you think determines that? And what modulates, so let's say if I don't change my selection operator, what modulates selective pressure? What about the population? Well, so that's interesting. You think it'd be more, you're just saying because they need to make more room? Okay. Any other thoughts? What would be an alternative hypothesis for population size? So what do we know about where drift has most power? It's in small population sizes, right? So this sort of barrier here, and I've mentioned this term before, so I'm just sort of adding this in because I think it'll help with the conversation about drifting balance theory. This height is sort of reflects a so-called drift barrier. And this is sort of the limit to a GA's ability to tune. And so what I mean by that is as you get closer and closer in fitness, then even though there are improvements, like there's still like, what drift sort of determines what is kind of a neutral improvement. So the effect of drift, you can imagine that like, there's a signal to noise ratio problem here. So if we think the signal is kind of fitness differences, then the noise is changes in fitness, I'll say delta fitness due to drift. So if you have a small population size, then even though you'll have, say, two individuals, one that is better than the other, the lower fitness individual still has a pretty good chance of staying in there just by random chance alone. So you might lose this high population, this high fitness individual, and you have to rediscover it. So as you get more and more population, then you might have two high fitness individuals, and you might lose one of them, but at least the other one will still stay around, and it will end up surviving to reproduce. So you find that this noise due to drift is reduced by adding population. So large population size have lower noise due to drift. So this, your ability to climb these hills is related to how much drift there is in there. Because it's kind of like once you've reached the drift barrier, so if I were to draw this on another hill, like if I were to say this is the drift barrier, what that basically means is that you've got selection dominates below it, but then above it, drift dominates. And again, this is motivating our next discussion about the shifting balance theory. So the bigger the population size, the more ability you have to climb up these fitness peaks. So finding the fitness peaks, that's sort of easy. Finding a peak, like, mini project one, you scatter, scatter shot the population all around. A bunch land in low fitness. A couple happen to just land at a high fitness peak. Those ones are so much better than all the others. All the others disappear. The one that's like up here ends up staying around, and then it fine tunes and it tries to climb up that. So finding a peak, that's sort of easy. That's going to happen in the first couple of generations. But then you're going to start crawling up the peak. And so at some point, the randomness due to drift is going to prevent consistent movement up the peak. Because it will be that, like, so down here, when I say this here, you've got large fitness differences. But up here, you've got small fitness differences. Because as you get to the top of the peak, things just get flatter. So the flatness at the top of the peak makes natural selection have less selective pressure, and it becomes much harder to fine tune and harder to beat back drift. So the population size kind of sets how, like, where the populations, if you have very large populations, they will tend to collect at the top of the mountain. They'll be very fine-tuned, they'll be very fit, and they'll be very similar to each other. If you have small population sizes, they will tend to be farther down the mountain because drift is going to prevent fine tuning. It's going to allow for lower fitness solutions to hang around for longer. They'll continue to reproduce, and you get much more of a coating of the mountain down the mountain there. So this sort of suggests the trade-off that Sewall Wright kind of had in mind here is that, yeah, if I have all of my population on one fitness peak, it is much more likely that we are going to find and maintain the highest fitness individual on that peak. But if I somehow could use drift to increase diversity, then maybe some of the individuals lower on this mountain will just randomly have offspring that will manage to survive the adaptive valley and get above the drift barrier, or at least on the upward slope of another mountain. That's the basic idea that I'm going to try to make more concrete when we talk about shifting balance theory. Where shifting balance theory comes out, I'm not sure it's really the best name for it, but it is, this balance between drift and selection, has to do with this. And so if we're thinking about when you're designing our architectures, you could say I've got 1,000 individuals or 100 individuals. If I put them all on one peak, what you're also doing is you're making your drift barrier much, much higher so that you're allowing selection to fine tune. But that is making it much harder to get down to the adaptive valley to cross it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Is there a way to know that for sure? If you have a priori knowledge, then so there are in stochastic optimization and global optimization, there are these things called like adaptive resetting processes, which basically say we're going to allow the stochastic optimizer, like an optimization meta heuristic, to run for a while, and then we're just going to stop at some point and just reinitialize it, and then we're going to do that again and again and again. And some of them are based on curvature, so it's like we're not making any improvements here anymore. We are at the top of this hill. It's not worth the extra computational budget we have. So if we have more computational budget left over, more iterations, then let's just remember this one and then just restart. Now, we don't know for sure that we're going to restart in a better place unless someone's given us, like, you can do like Bayesian optimization where you can say, I don't know where the best spots are in the decision space, but they're probably not here. They're not here, not here. We have some evidence that they're maybe here, but we have also a little bit of evidence that maybe a little less likely here. And then so you can draw your populations from this kind of Bayesian distribution of where you might find them. And so you could do your adaptive restart and then try to, like, okay, we happen to get one here, so next time we'll kind of over here and so on. But I mean, that's the whole thing about global optimization. For all you know, there's one peak and you're on it. But usually in these problems, there's multiple peaks and you have no idea if you're on the highest one, the lowest one. If you knew that there was a highest one out there, you probably didn't have to start the problem to begin with. Okay. This is the general motivation for shifting balance theory. So what then does shifting balance theory suggest here? We're saying, well, if we have many mostly isolated subpopulations, that's kind of our assumption here. Then, what do we got here? Well, so one, we have small, I'll say subpopulation sizes. And so that's going to mean that genetic drift is strong in each subpopulation. Now, I want to emphasize here the mostly isolated. if there's a lot of migration, if these subpopulations here just frequently interact with the subpopulations here, and they might interact more frequently with their locals, but if there's still and exactly what do we mean by a lot of migration? Well, that can be kind of difficult here, but the idea here is that there's sort of there's kind of a critical amount of migration below which you have to be for this to be useful. Once you get kind of high enough, then you can approximate the population as being so-called panmictic. So it's sort of a well-mixed population. And so at that point, it doesn't really matter. Like once you've got airplanes, it doesn't really matter what continent you live on because you can have gene flow on a daily basis from continent to continent to continent. You get rid of all the airplanes, and then suddenly you get subpopulations, just differences among geographic groups that may have totally everything to do with drift. They may have nothing to do with selection. But once you put the airplanes back in, then if there's drift, the drift is happening at a global scale, not at these individual subpopulation scales. So that's what we're talking about here. We've got to emphasize that these do not migrate very often. That's why in GAs like parallel GAs like MATLABs, you can adjust the migration rate. So you can sort of figure out that's another hyperparameter to sort of say once it's high enough, then it doesn't, it's just a canonical GA. But once you make it low enough, if it's too low, then maybe you don't benefit because you're just basically running 3 bad GAs in parallel. But if it's slightly higher than low and than being too low, then you might notice that the ensemble of your 3 GAs in parallel starts doing better than your canonical GA where you just put them all in one population. All right, so that's the first thing we got. Small population sizes, genetic drift is the strongest. And so each subpopulation is going to kind of explore their genotypic space more readily. So we have more local exploration on population peaks near local optima. So we have I'll say a lower drift barrier in terms of altitude, lower altitude drift barrier. And that's sort of one of the key things there. So everybody understand what I mean from that last picture there. Smaller subpopulations, even though they're smaller, they spread out more because there's a greater chance that the ones at the top, it's lonely at the top, right? It's lonely being king or whatever the heavy is the head, et cetera, et cetera. If you only got one that it's up there, then they're just as likely to get knocked out by drift than anyone else. So they're not going to then dominate the population. So it's kind of counterintuitive that smaller there's a trade-off, right? Because if you only have 2 individuals, they can't spread out that much. But generally speaking, smaller population sizes have the ability to sample from a wider space. Selection doesn't concentrate them as much. Okay, and then process 2 then, once we've got that going on, then now 2, then individuals in adaptive valleys can sometimes be pulled up into new fitness peaks. So individuals can descend close enough to adaptive valleys to be swept across them. Via mutation, for example. So the innovation that allows you to fine tune at the top of the hill, if you can get close enough to the bottom of the hill, that same innovation can kick you across the hill. And once you're on the upslope of another hill, then selection takes over and then it pulls you up the new hill. That's sort of the basic idea here. So that's the third part here. Then migrants from subpopulations. Um, uh, well, okay, so then that's the hill there. But then we can have the third process here is that migrants from subpopulations at higher peaks can send off um, my to lower fitness peaks to share genes. So that's kind of so that's the additional thing here is that here we've got these are low fitness individuals finding nearby high peaks. It's a little compressed there, I'm sorry. And these here are high fitness individuals sharing adaptations. So that's kind of the interesting thing about this is not only does this give the ability for individuals to escape their local suboptima, but it also allows individuals who are at the current best peak to export migrants that may have a feature of their genotype that is just not in any of the others to combine with them, and then this can benefit. This lead by crossover, for example, um, to new solutions. So this can allow for even more innovation. So just in general, what you get are these, and I'll use this phrase here that Wade and Goodnight came up with. I'm probably going to get it wrong here until I reread it, but it's like microscale experiments. So each little fitness peak becomes a kind of little experiment in evolution that periodically they publish papers, they disseminate their results to all of the other little fitness peaks. And so the low fitness peaks say, well, they explore and they say, well, let me try something new that you're doing over here. The high fitness peaks that found an evolution in their genotype get to export that to lower fitness peaks that then they can then incorporate. And then maybe that synthesis of their genotype with, so it's another diversity preservation idea is that if you have a good, innovation here, combined with an almost good innovation here, when you combine those things together, they may actually find a new fitness peak that's higher than both. So you could have, individuals that are here and individuals that are here, but nobody's up here yet. But this individual has got a high enough fitness that they've got enough individuals that they can export some migrants that manage to find themselves, so it's a little funny, this topology here. Remember, this is genotype space, so they're not actually separated by this huge distance here. It's a weird space that it's hard to visualize in 2D here, but these individuals can recombine with these individuals, and the genotype here that maybe has a bunch of pre-adaptations, they're just not quite functional yet. When they combine with these things that are functional, create totally new innovations, like it's like the no-ops in the code suddenly get turned on, and all of those new functions bring them up to here. So now you can discover this. So all of these things that were frictions and exploration, suddenly by spreading things out across these subpopulations that do their own thing independently and then periodically share a little bit, allow for these innovations. And I think I mentioned the link to publication, like little scientific labs that are disseminated by publication. I feel like even in science, we see something similar to that. It's that when you have a bunch of labs that know at high throughput what each other's doing, they end up kind of doing the same thing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If they're fine tuning, if they're working on a particular cancer or something like that, then it's just good to have more heads, working on that problem. And then you can fine tune that problem. You can find the next marginal improvement. But If you're talking about something doing discovery, then that's I think why we have scientific conferences, is that you've got a group here in the States, maybe a group over there in Europe, another group in India, another group in Australia, and they're doing their own thing for a year at a time, maybe multiple years at a time. Maybe a student isn't ready to bring their stuff, especially in science. Computer science is like every month, you're expected to publish, but but most of the sciences, it takes longer to set that stuff up, and then you end up sharing, and you're like, well, that is a totally new idea that I hadn't thought of before. And and you only like I didn't influence you, and so you did your own independent thing. You didn't influence me, so I did my own independent thing. We found our own sort of ways to be successful. And now that we've shared, we found a third way that is even more successful than our independent ways. And that's kind of what's happening here in this evolutionary innovation with this so-called shifting balance theory. So, any questions about this process? About this theory for why these distributed GAs tend to be better at global optimization than a canonical GA? And you don't have to implement them on a parallel architecture either. Like, you can just set this up, you can just schedule this on a single processor to work this same way. And it still conceivably can work better than a canonical GA. So it has started out as a way to speed up the GAs by using parallel resources, but it ended up as something that would even work on a single processor. Yeah. So the idea here, like why they're spread out, or so the idea here is that if you have only a couple of individuals, if you had high selective pressure, then when you did your selection operator, then this individual, it'd be almost like not, it'd be like a deterministic process. This individual would reproduce and produce a little variation around it, and then the next 100 individuals would come from this variation right here. All of these would get killed off. If you've got a small number of individuals, there's a higher chance that if you do have randomness in your selection operator, so in natural systems, randomness in the selection operator is just random events, like a meteor hits you or something like that. A meteor could hit any one of us. It doesn't matter how smart we are or whatever other proxies of fitness are. Fitness doesn't matter when there's a meteor. So that's, for small population sizes, kills the whole population in one swoop, or it kills most of it, and whoever's left over, totally random. You could hope that it's like, oh, I really hope I hope she is left over. She is the one who's going to save the Earth. Of course, she's going to be hit, right? So he will be the one that's left over, and maybe we'll be okay. But that's drift right there, and that's just the meteors coming. And so if you only have her and him, then you're just leaving everything up to chance. Now, if you've got a bunch of her and a few of him, then the meteor can hit and you've got redundancy. And so that's the basic idea behind the drift barrier. So small population sizes mean that there are going to be low fitness individuals who are going to hang around. And there'll be high fitness individuals that don't do as well as you might expect. And that's what creates diversity in these local fitness peaks. The upside of diversity is when you have multiple peaks, then potentially these low fitness solutions can cross these barriers. And if they go down this, all they do is cross this point. Once they're over here, then you can count that there's high selective pressure here because it's a steep slope. So any one of these things that have steep slope has got a high chance that anyone at the bottom will very quickly send offspring up to the top. Then there'll be their own drift barrier. So then once you get here, you're still going to get individuals that go up here, but there's still, just by random chance, you'll end up still getting populations kind of all over this thing. Yeah, and that's this part down here, is that if you do have them on high optima, like this could be the global, or the global could be like over here somewhere that I haven't drawn, but it's a high one. And so the thought here is that there's still a chance that there will be individuals around this global that have a key genetic innovation that they could share with these to end up making for an even better solution. And so not only does this shifting balance idea suggest a mechanism for low fitness individuals to find high fitness peaks, and then the process of tuning will get them up. But it also suggests a way for high fitness individuals to share genes with low fitness peaks. So through the process of recombination, then you get totally new solutions, which might lead you to peaks you don't even know about that are even higher. Okay. All right. So that's shifting balance theory. And like I said, this is something that um, that was, has been called, small experiments in evolution, which I think is a nice phrase. And this was something by Wade and Goodnight. Just because it's a quote, I just thought I'd give them credit. I think 1998. And then, actually my appointment is split between Sky, Computing Augmented Intelligence, and School of Life Sciences. The office I have in Life Sciences is actually abuts next to one of Wade's former grad students, Tim Linksfair. And so we'll sometimes chat about this. We co-advise some students, and so we'll talk about how like there hasn't been, and I think even in Wade's the old paper here, I think there's been maybe a lot of movement since 1998, but this exact picture of how shifting balance theory is theorized to work, it's really hard to because we don't have evolutionary trajectories in real life systems. Like we don't know all of those fine-grained details to say, there was an adaptive valley and it was crossed here because of the drift barrier, whatever and whatever. But what we do know now is that population structure matters a lot to real life evolutionary innovation. So back, in Darwin's time, it was just easiest to think about every individual having an equal probability to mate with every other individual, or an equal probability to be able to spread its genes through some mechanism to any others. But now we kind of know through a variety of different theories. There's not only this, but there's island biogeography theory and other sorts of things that are related to that. And I only mentioned biogeography theory. That's one of there's another a optimization meta heuristic based on that is one of the options for your final project I put up there. So a lot of other interesting theories about this, but generally what we know is that this idea that there's every individual potentially could interact with every individual in the next generation is not a realistic one. And when you relax that assumption and you assume that individuals kind of can get stuck for a long time, you get very different evolutionary dynamics. And that was really what Sewall Wright's main point that he was trying to make is that drift matters. Whenever you get populations that are isolated, then they'll have a larger share of evolutionary movement due to drift than populations that are much larger. And so they're going to have different kind of uh, discovery trajectories here than there would be here. And so although you've got more ability to fine tune with large populations, you've got more exploitation ability with large populations, more exploration ability with small populations. So when you blend populations of different sizes, you sort of have a different way to search the genotype space than if you just have one big population where really once you get kind of a sufficient solution, you're just going to sit there and fine tune it. And so that's kind of the general idea. All right, so that was shifting balance theory. So yeah, so now I think we're ready to move on. So any questions here about this general idea? This is a quick diversion into distributed genetic algorithms just to motivate this idea of multimodality and the value of maintaining diversity in populations, which sets us up for the last topic of this unit. Okay. All right, so now that we've learned a lot more about these approaches, then it gives us more ways to think about the canonical GA and the things we could do with the canonical GA if only we could do things like manage its diversity better. So even without doing these distributed architectures where there's migration or whatever, maybe there's still ways that we can maintain diversity without forcing subpopulations not to mix, except for, small amounts of time. So, and the way we might implement that by that migration might just be that you run for 1,000 generations, and then only every 1,000th generation, you have some scheduling protocol for sampling a fraction from one population and sharing them with another population. That might be what we mean by periodic mixing. So that's so that's something we could implement that way. But maybe there are other ways that we could do kind of diversity maintenance and generation. And so that leads to the topic of multimodal optimization. Okay, so at the end of mini project one, you're sitting there looking at your results, and hopefully you're proud of the thing that you built because you've got a fitness objective I gave you, whatever, sine x over x or something like that. So, it had a bunch of these little peaks, and you end up getting a population. Oh, no, come back. You end up getting a population that is kind of clustered at the top of one of those peaks. You look at that and say, my little population of 100 that's clustered on the top of that peak, so this is my x and this is my f of x, then I might just look at this output here and I'll take the max individual, and that will be my solution. Great. But you look at that, and it's kind of cool that in a short number of generations where you randomly initialize it, that this process, this kind of kooky process inspired by evolution, manages to concentrate the population in one spot and then the right spot. And it does it pretty reliably. Sometimes you rerun your GA and it pops up into the wrong peak, but most of the times it's in the right peak. It's kind of nice, but it also looks a little bit like a waste, because you've got these like 100 individuals and they all are roughly in the same spot, but you only care about one of them. So there's like this additional information that you just don't use about those 100 individuals. So the thought here was, now that we know more about diversity preservation and so on, can we solve a slightly different problem? And also just in general about research directions, what also happened here is if you want, as a grad student, you want to develop a new optimization meta heuristic, it's really hard to compete in the single objective space because there's all sorts of ways to do single objective optimization numerically, and GAs are fine for if you need to do simulation optimization, stuff like that. But if you're doing numerical optimization of analytical functions and things, there are other things that you could do that are probably faster, that are probably better, that are probably more reliable. So, but people have to publish papers, right? So they say, well, can we come up with a new niche? Like if you're, universities do this too. Like if you're not number one in some category, then figure out the category you're number one in, and then get people to start measuring that category, that sort of thing. And so the idea here is like, well, what if we create a problem, which I think ends up being a useful problem, but it's a problem that I think at the time not a lot of people were looking for. And they'd say, well, let's shift this to say, can we find all peaks, not just the one? Because it might be that some of these peaks over here are not bad peaks, and they might actually be much cheaper to implement. And so if I only find this one, that's fine. It might be, there might be a certain cost to that. But if I were to find this one that's just next door, it doesn't have much of a decrease in my optimization objective that I'm trying to maximize. But maybe this genotype difference, this difference in implementation, is actually pretty attractive to me. So there's always hidden multi-objective problems here. If I would have done a multi-objective optimization with cost in F, then maybe it would show me that trade-off space where I get all of these points at the top in one Pareto frontier. And I'd see that if I want to minimize cost, I go in this direction at the cost of fitness. If I want to maximize this direction, I go in this direction at the cost of cost. But I didn't know that cost was important to me. And so, I only put one optimization objective. So ideally, we'd think, well, what if we want a solution that, we're going to take the same objective here, but we would like an output. I'm just going to draw the same curve. I'm going to attempt to draw the same curve. I could have just copied and pasted, I guess it. But ideally, we would like, instead of clustering them all at one peak, we would just like to then maybe have a couple, representation, but basically get them as close to possible to their own local peaks. So now the output population is the set of all peaks. And this is so-called multimodal optimization. And that's what we would like to do. And we think it's possible because we know that genetic algorithms can generate Pareto frontiers set-based. We know that there's ways to maintain subpopulations at a variety of fitness levels, even in a single objective GA. So can we kind of pull on that thread a little bit more to make these the kind of desirable outputs? So how do we do that? And it's going to be all about diversity preservation, really. What are different ways in which I can maintain diversity while I'm doing a canonical GA? Okay. And this sort of allows for both kind of breadth and depth. You can fine tune locally, but you can also find everything here. So if a GA is kind of a greedy depth first, well, I don't even call it depth first. If a GA is kind of a greedy search, then this is trying to fill out the whole search tree and find everything. Okay. So questions about that general goal? Stabilizing populations at all peaks and try to do it in a cheap way, because we're going to find that diversity preservation is not computationally cheap. It's not trivial to maintain diversity. So among all the different diversity preservation approaches, which ones are the cheapest? So we're introducing then niche preserving techniques. So again, we're using language. Now we've been using language from population genetics. Now we're using languages from kind of community ecology. And so blending those together. And this is again something that this is right now in the context of multimodal. But again, there's cross-pollination, there's gene flow. And so the innovations in niche preserving techniques for multimodal, even if you're not a huge fan of multimodal, some of these then have been incorporated into more sophisticated multi-objective optimization, because niche preservation matters there too. So, little experiments kind of independently separated end up allowing for interesting innovations to occur. So this particular problem, even though you don't like the problem, its solutions are sometimes modular and can be used for problems that we know might be more useful. So, we're trying to, the idea here is promote, and this is another, I think, quote that I'm getting from somewhere, promote diversity along useful dimensions while letting others converge. And I like this quote a lot. Useful dimensions while letting others converge. And the reason I like this quote, which I think is in a paper that I posted online, is that it's this is weird, this idea of multimodal optimization, because it's not multi-objective. Multi-objective, it's very clear that I'm like, there's this one thing that I could do well, there's this one thing I do well, and there's this whole suite of different ways that I could do mixtures of those things. And in that case, it's very clear to me like where the kind of terminal community is and where the diversity, like the dimensions are clear here. For single objective optimization, I guess I have one objective. Like, don't I just want to move uphill? Like, and this is sort of suggesting that even though you only have one objective, you there are somehow multiple dimensions there. You know, there's ways where you're sort of classifying that that I want, you know, I want to maintain movement across these peaks. But once I'm in the peaks, then I just want to converge. Like, you know, in the dimension of moving around a peak, I want to converge. So you have like a single point up here, but I want to find all of the peaks. So when you have a good multimodal optimization, you're not going to get very much variance at all around here. You're just going to get peak, 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 peak. And so you've got strong selection within the peaks, but strong exploration outside of the peaks, which is what we're kind of shooting for here. Okay. So we want to, you know, reduce the effects of genetic drift, allow the GA to search for different ways. And so how, you know, might we do that? Well, we've already talked about fitness sharing, so we can kind of elaborate those approaches. So one approach is fitness sharing, which are, you know, similar to what we've already seen, you know, similar to multi-objective. I think I'll talk about just two different methods of fitness sharing. So the one method that we've already kind of seen before is we're going to say that the shared fitness of solution I is just going to be its regular or original fitness divided by some neighborhood size, which I'll call, you know, our niche size. I'll just call in C of I, where I'm going to define in C of I as a sum. So this is sort of an accumulated penalty or award or so I'm going to look across all of my individuals and I'm going to create some sharing function S that is a function of the distance between I and J. And then here we've got Dij is distance between I and J. Now, in this case, because we're talking about multimodal, it's a single objective, then this distance here is in genotype space. I mean, it can't be in anything else. There's nothing other to measure, but just making sure that it's clear that this is like you know, if it's a numerical genotype, it's like the Euclidean distance between two different solutions. You know, it's just take the two norm between the two different solutions, or whatever norm you'd like. So it's some distance between those two solutions. So I'll say that, I'll just write it out here, maybe that the Dij here could be like x I minus xj. That is our Dij. Now, you could, I'll say it's typically, you know, I'm going to go back on what I just said here. It's typically genotype, but I guess you actually can, I'll say, I'm just going to write that so the O is clear. Genotype typically, but you could do f of xi minus f of xj. And so this would be sort of a functional distance, but this is going to be less common in multimodal. Because remember, the goal here is you're okay with fitnesses being similar, you want to find all the peaks. And there might be, if it's a sine wave, all the peaks are at the same fitness. So that's the reason why really we're going to penalize genotype distance. That's why we don't really care that much about here. So that's why I'm just going to sort of focus on that. It's typically genotype here is our DIJ. All right, so what is this sharing function? It's, we just like to give lots and lots of hyperparameters and different things that people can tune. So Sij, sorry, not Sij, S of Dij, we're going to define as, there. If you're within some radius, some parameter, then we're going to penalize that count. We're going to count. If you're outside of that, we're not going to count it. So so I'll say that it is 1 minus the distance Dij divided by some sigma share parameter raised to some alpha, and that's if the Dij is less than that sigma share. 0 otherwise. I'm just going to put a little box around this to make it clear. So if you don't like this alpha stuff right now, just imagine that alpha is equal to 0. If that alpha is equal to 0, that's just a parameter. You can set a hyperparameter. Then this is basically going to say I'm going to count the number of individuals that are sigma share away from me. That's all this is. This is basically a weighted count. I'll say a penalized count. Discounted. A discounted count. How about that? Discounted count of individuals within sigma share distance. And so if you happen to be nearby a bunch of others, then likely all of you will have the same NC, because you'll all end up falling within this bubble. And so then that NC then will divide all of your original fitness by that down. Now, what this allows for is it allows you to define this function that doesn't make it so stark, the edges of this. So if you set this alpha higher, then it allows for sort of a blurred thing, so that as your distance gets, if your distance is right at sigma share, then this ends up being sort of a 1. But if your distance is 0, like you can sort of adjust kind of the penalty away from me, so that if you're right next to me, I'm going to get a stronger count than if you're a little farther away but still inside sigma share. Once you're outside of sigma share, then I don't care about you at all. You're not part of my count. So all this is doing is allowing you to bring the count to sort of to create a kind of a region of soft penalty around you. And that's sort of the idea here, sort of how much you penalize that. So I said before, like if you set this to infinity, so here, if alpha equals infinity, this is a normal count. If alpha is, gets lower to 0, so I'll say, also less than 0 or less than infinity, then it is a softer count. I'll say soft count. Because this thing is always less than 0 or less than 1. So if alpha is equal to infinity, this is a 0 and that just becomes a 1. If this thing is anything less than infinity, then you've got that nice effect. All right, so that's generic fitness sharing. That's where we're going to stop. And then so that on Tuesday, we'll wrap this up with talking about other ways to do fitness sharing, other ways to do clearing, and then we'll be done with multimodal. And then we'll be able to start finally getting out of genetics and moving into simulated annealing. So things inspired by physics. And so we'll talk about entropy and what the heck entropy is and so on. And like I said, Stephanie should be coming in a week from today to talk to us about GenProg. All right, that's it. That's all I got. So thanks, guys, and have a good weekend. We'll see you Tuesday.